Great. So are you also online as well? Or are you just on the call? All right. Oh, okay, great, great, great. All right. So my name is Andre Cohen, and I am the cultural coordinator here at the Adler Graduate School and facilitator of CEU Partners. And I want to say thank you so much for joining us in this conversation. And what are you hoping to get out of this conversation? So, what were some of your expectations? Did you have any expectations as you signed up for this? Okay. There are at least three people on the conference line. Are you hearing an echo? Okay. Yeah. So what perspective are you coming with? Yeah. So one of the things I certainly can share with you is that the concept comes like many concepts that particularly Black people have to deal with, will be responsible to, and to that end, so African American versus Afro American versus kind of Black or Negro, birthing out of some kind of scientific stuff. What I will say is that people of color is uh, an interesting tool that's currently being used to try to give dignity, or to talk in a non-prejudicial way. And it's actually people of color is birthed out of the so-called disabilities movement. And the key point in that disabilities movement is really talking about people first. So human beings being people first, and then whatever labels we want to give them, that comes secondary. Obviously, there are some problems or some challenges that come with trying to label people or name people. For example, people of color typically is a term used for African Americans, for Hispanic Americans, for Asian Americans, Southeast Asian Americans, but would be inappropriate to use for Native Americans because they don't necessarily see themselves as people of color being grouped in those same kinds of ways. And so when we think about, any kind of blanket covering that we try to give people, we can recognize that any term does not necessarily fit all of the people involved. Thoughts about what I just shared? So in your work, how do you talk about people without labels or without putting labels on that? How does that happen in your work? Yeah, yeah. And unfortunately, well, I certainly think that we need to have the conversation, because for a lot of people, they're really confused about that. And the nuance of colored versus colored people is difficult for people to put their heads around. And so it's important to at least have the conversation. I agree with you that, do we need to fight about that? I would definitely say no, but I think we do need to have some conversation around what the nuance is, because some folks don't see the necessity of or understand the nuance being putting people first. And so obviously we should not be putting labels on people, but it is interesting what happens when people accept labels or participate in a label. For example, people of color and Native Americans not saying we're not people of color, so don't put us in that group. And folks being able to respect that and articulate that in a powerful way. Well, one of the things I like to submit to you is that labels and names and all those things are contextual. And as the context changes, how and what we call things also needs to change with the context. For example, I was just at a child protection symposium, and I remember the conversations about bad touch, good touch, and how you're supposed to teach your kids about stranger danger. Well, as we've learned more about child abduction cases and abuse, it's not the stranger that you should be as concerned with. It's more the people that they know, that your child knows, and all this idea of bad touch versus good touch, that gets really murky. And so having conversations about those terms, really given new information, really helps us to articulate ourselves better and more effectively. And I think as we've had these cultural shifts which is reflective in the terminology, or the seeking to at least be more respectful, I believe that there will probably be more incarnations of titles and labels that will come as the context changes as we move forward in time. And so the question for me typically is, what is the intent of the name that you call me? My mother calling me boy has a different, it is a different thing than a stranger referring to me as a boy in another context. So, so as we think about those things, I think intention is important in the words that are either chosen or the labels that we take on. What are your thoughts about that? Yeah, there certainly is a pitfall, which I think why it's important to have conversations that actually lead us to figuring out what that means in our own organizations, figuring out what that means to us personally, because when we get into the workplace, we have to rely on the organization itself to be able to define those things, because the organization is going to judge its members by what it professes itself, or it should judge its members by what it professes itself in its policies and its procedures, so forth and so on. I know that folks don't like the term, or sometimes even the policies, or what they believe or what they think about the policies of affirmative action. But it is an important tool, no matter what we call it, that allows us to actually make some movement forward in creating more equitable workplaces. And so those, however we whatever terms we want to use, becomes important. Sidebar, it is interesting to me, though, that affirmative action programs are important, and they have some legal standings where diversity training or cultural competence training doesn't have the same level of teeth. They are designed to support those affirmative action programs, but they don't necessarily have the same teeth that affirmative action programs do. And so people can sometimes try to get those, sometimes people get those things confused when they don't have to, because those things are very clearly defined. Have you in your work seen people kind of mix those two programs, or get those things confused? Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting because I found that to be one of those common rubs in organizations. And one thing that I often do with clients that I work with people that I'm trying to advise through the, kind of that maze uh, of and I guess I'm very pragmatic. So when we talk about affirmative action, we're really talking about those things that impact directly hiring and educating and retaining our employees, um, watching them, how they come in the door, what happens when they're in the door, and then how do they leave, out of what door do they leave, or what condition are they in as they leave the organization. And I think sometimes what diversity resource groups get confused is that if they're not helping affirmative action programming by educating, affirming what people are doing inside the organization, then they may be overstepping their bounds or out of order, so to speak. And so, and then organizations that don't have strong affirmative action programs or an eye towards that can be usurped by programs that aren't accountable to anything. And then ultimately, when we talk about accountability, all of those employment activities are accountable to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and so that has to be paramount. And all the in the things that follow 65 and 66, all of those activities have to be supportive of the laws of the land and how they're played out and demonstrated. I will, yeah, send me an email and I will send you a transcript. Yeah, it looks like. Because you are. So this is interesting. The question you ask is the answer that you get, right? So the question is important. So if they're looking for lack, they're going to find lack. And if you're moving to solve problems, those two approaches are by design opposing forces. Um, so, the need and the necessity to find those gaps are important. But in every instance, particularly in this organization, if you point out a problem to me, I want you to come up with a solution as well, so that we get this balanced approach. Because what ends up happening, particularly when we have uh, uh, caucus groups or focus groups or ethnic minority group, I mean, whatever they're called in organizations, what they become is complaining sessions, as opposed to, if they're not guided properly, they become complaining sessions as opposed to actually helpful tools to bring new and bright ideas to the organization. So I would, really encourage them to shift that focus, instead of looking at the negatives, recognize that those negatives are there, but also with that data, come up with some real heartfelt, not heartfelt, but some real concrete things that they can do to change things. For example, working with hiring managers, I ran into a number of situations where what we decided, because they felt that either staff or folks may have been employing some implicit bias that they didn't even recognize, we started numbering. Job applications and blotting out names. So then we had this numerical thing, and then it seemed a bit impersonal, but one of the things we were trying to do was really isolate why our organization, or why their particular organization, kept churning out very similar results. They weren't diversifying in the ways that they felt necessary. Another thing that we also did was had people focus on goals as opposed to focusing on what we've always done. And so what's the goal of the organization? Constantly holding the goals up. And looking at some of the root causes of why we continually so-called have these problems. And so really not just looking at the problems, but creating action plans and demanding that that there's positive education as a part of that process became, in those two organizations, paramount to really turn the tide from these complaining sessions that these employee resource groups were having, to really having them churn out some dynamic both programs as well as policies that could actually be helpful. And here's a distinction. For the D&I folks, you're really focusing on the policies that affect or impact people's hiring, retention, and their ability to, or their willingness to stay, right? So the other part of retention. The resource groups really should be program oriented in such a way that it fuels everything that the affirmative action or the D&I office is doing. So, Cinco de Mayo, that should be the function of a resource group, but not the function of D&I, because you're really talking about working with upper level management, with hiring managers, with supervisors on activities that keep the organization fluent and solvent around diversity and inclusion. And the softer things, the engagement pieces, need to come from those resource groups. I gave you a lot of stuff. Does any of that make sense, or have you done some of those things? Yep. Yeah, so I have, so make sure, and I'm serious about this, make sure you email me so that I can, there's a chart that I use that talks about the three functions of particularly HR oriented work around this diversity and inclusion piece. And so I'll give you the basic gist that there are affirmative actions, and there's an S on that, right? So we are talking about affirmative action itself, but then all of the policies and procedures that go along with the legal ramifications or the legal accountabilities that HR and organizations have. Then we move over into the softer things that are great things to do. These are best practices, but are not legally mandated for organizations to do. And that's where cultural competence comes in, sensitivity training comes in, um, productive workplaces comes in. So that would be the second strand. And then the third strand actually is fed into the other two, in that the third strand is really about personal intention. And so we know that the law measures impact. And so those first two categories really deal with the impact of things. But we know that the third category, it has a balance as well, because it is the human relationships that actually can have bearing on those first two columns. And so we have to make sure that people have the right intentions. So I'll send you that graph because it may help you and to be able in having a conversation with those folks, because that is a serious rub that resource groups fall into all the time. They think that they should be doing things that are not a part of their responsibility. And oftentimes, and it sounds like you're very clear about it, but oftentimes even affirmative action folks or diversity and inclusion folks aren't clear on what their roles are. And so that murkiness becomes a source of conflict as opposed to a place where collateral can be built and we can have a trajectory towards success. And that's where that rub of people of color versus color of people, colored people comes from. We know that historically, colored people was reserved and given to people of color by people who were not trying to be respectful. Where this idea of people of color is trying to come from a place of respect and dignity um, and empowerment. Whether it meets that goal or not is up to us as professionals to try to figure that out. So as I look at so for whatever reason, the other people on the call aren't encouraged to speak up, but I can't make people do that. But I'll have another call tomorrow if you're interested in coming in and talking some more or just listening in. And tomorrow we'll be talking about micro inequities and discretionary effort, the balance or the ratio between those two concepts. Yeah, well, I'll make sure that I send you a. I'll send you either the transcript or the recording of that session, so you can look along. You can look at it and see how it, and maybe even offer some stuff to us as we have that conversation. So I want to say thank you so much for joining us today. Super. Anytime. You know, I'm if I'm able to help, I certainly will. Not a problem. You too. Goodbye.